Excel screen. First thing I want to address is the definition of the concept of diaspora. We have to start with the definition of diaspora. And diaspora, to a large extent, is by definition. Okay, thank you. Diaspora. So it's not for me to say what it is, but the concept or the topic today is about diaspora. And diaspora will have to start with this definition. Now, who is a diaspora or who is in the diaspora? Now, just a bit. That's the definition of a diaspora. An individual, a member of networks, associations, or communities who have left their country in their physical form, but maintain links with that country. That's the definition by the International Organization of Migration. Very important to put that in context. Then we also have the question of Africans in diaspora. What are the numbers we're looking at? The numbers we're looking at is on average about 140 million, which makes up about 10% or 10 to 11% of the African current population. There's no data that kind of breaks it down into smaller stratas or any demographics, but about 10-11% of the population is kind of in the diaspora. While Africa is growing at an average rate of about 2.5 to about 3% per annum, which is about 3.25 million new Africans on average to about 4 million Africans annually. And that's quite a large number in terms of 3%, in terms of the overall growth. When we look at the Africans in diaspora, it says here that the global remittances, this is where remittances fits in, and I think that's where the data will be coming into the context of today's work or today's submissions, is that the remittance flow has increased generally in Africa by about 9% during the year. Interestingly, North Africa, Egypt particularly, has been able to raise remittance of about 30 billion, which is about 5.56% of the overall global remittances. Interesting. In Egypt alone. It means that Egypt, to a large extent, has a large population or expects to have a large population. Maybe not a large population, but maybe a very high net worth or earnings capacity overseas, possibly. The general perception is Sub-Saharan Africa has basically had 56 billion, and North Africa, so that's about Africa. North Africa has about 56 billion coming in terms of remittances, and Sub-Saharan Africa had about 45 billion. So you can see that North Africa, with the proximity to Europe and to a large extent America, seems to be a very important channel for remittances. Now, one important thing before going into data is the statement by Narayan Murthy, the guy who owns Infosys in India. He says, well, in God we trust, but everyone else must bring data to the table. And this is where we are now. The data on the table suggests that this is where the main destinations, sorry, these are not origins, these are actually destinations, remittances origins. Now, most migrants overseas or diasporans overseas seems to be more in the US, UAE, interestingly. Saudi Arabia is very interesting, these two, that Saudi Arabia and UAE that don't really have taxes seem to have a higher level of migrant force, I think coming mostly from Asia. Switzerland, Germany, China, put all together, and you have about remittances from all over the world of about 377 to 500 billion. Now, putting that data into context, you will see here, okay, so it doesn't allow me. So the US generally is a major source of remittances in the world, and remittances only represent about 0.3% of the US GDP, which is very tiny. Although in United Arab Emirates, it's about 12%, Saudi Arabia about 4%. They allow such money to leave their shores because, to a large extent, they have a huge migrant workforce. Now, put into context, those remittances, if I go to the right, seems to come from this destination. So in Africa, based on the data I found, published data, the history of migration over the years has been in this frame. So I'm trying to put it into frame. Has been around this frame, and you can see the main countries, and you can see Egypt quite particularly somewhere along the numbers that have been going overseas. Now, if I put it into data analysis, just on the data sets there, what is looking like when analyzing more detail is suggesting that trying to fit everything into one screen, which is possible. Can you still see the screen?
Yes, please, we can. Yes, we can.
I see all data. Okay. So where you see Egypt generally. 1990, the total population that was migrating was about 11 to 12 million, which was about 1.86% of the population of Africa. By 2020, 10 years later, the population migrating had gone from 11.8 million to about 28 million, which is making up about 2.6%. So in terms of ratios, it's increased. In terms of numbers, it's also increased, even though the growth has also increased significantly. So what you're looking at here is that the number of increases and the change in data suggests that only one country, Ethiopia particularly, I think it's because they had some wars around this time, but generally Ethiopia was the only country that had a lower percentage growth in terms of numbers living. But there was a significant increase in numbers over the years. I think it's about 136%, which is about 1.3 times. And if you look at these numbers, it looks like the numbers that are migrating out or exiting Africa seems to be quite significant. When you break it down into more detail and you summarize it into regions, then this data comes forth. Central Africa particularly was not represented much in the top numbers migrating, but if you look at the numbers here from East Africa and the percentages, you would see clearly that number one, there seems to be a very serious increase here in East Africa. It's about 36% increase. West Africa, Southern Africa used to be quite significant, but actually has dropped significantly recently. Not sure. I think there's more inter-Africa migration going on there. West Africa has picked up quite significantly. And then when you come to the point of numbers, reconciling the numbers, I try to reconcile the numbers to this 28 million to this 28 million here. I try to reconcile them using these data sets. And that's what I got here. But that's not the main thrust of what I'm trying to drive at. My main thrust of what I'm driving out here is more of the countries that actually migrate. Now, before I divert into that, let me quickly go into these data sets here from MPI, the Migration Policy Institute. Now, this is a whole very well presented chart of migrations from different regions. So before we say Africa migrates, let's even look at internal migrations first. Not very significant. Emigration, basically, not immigration. When we change it to migration outside, then you begin to see a better picture. So the data would have actually indicated the numbers emigrating, and you'd have seen bigger bubbles. The brown bubbles would have indicated a lot more immigration. It's not really showing, sorry. Very slow. Okay, I'm just going to move away from that. So when we look at the countries, so look at the countries where basically people are migrating to, the destinations, and which is why it's very important that I freeze this. Where they're migrating to, here's the population of the country, here's basically the weight of the top 10 countries that people are immigrating to. Interestingly, the numbers of top 10 countries is almost the same thing as the number of Africans migrating, 140 million. Then we look at the numbers of where they migrate to, seems to be somewhere around here. We look at the general GDP. Why do they immigrate there? It's because of the income differentials in dollars. So we look at the GDP per country, and it looks quite high generally, except this country, Russia, who doesn't have really much. But generally speaking, if you go to the right of it, GDP per capita, we try to look at the living standards in terms of cost of living. So you have this income, for example, in the US, you have this cost of living, and you have very little money left. Only Germany, I think, has quite a significant amount of income left. Now, what I try to do is to use those ratios to understand why people are migrating there. And I looked at the exchange rates. Is it because of exchange rates that people are actually moving to those countries? Is it the African exchange rate that is depreciating, that's possibly causing people to go overseas so they can have more money to remit? If you look at Europe generally, or these countries where they migrate to, the average or the typical inflation rate or the so-called exchange rate differentials in 10 years between 2012 and 2022 has also been about 20% plus. Now, the other countries would actually migrate most, and these are the countries that migrate most: India, Mexico, Russia, China. So Africa is just one of those countries that migrate a lot too. And the exchange rate differentials for those countries has been quite significant. Africa particularly, and we'll come to this data set here, Africa particularly has had a very bad exchange rate problem. And when you're not very productive, your exchange rate falls. If your exchange rate falls, what happens? You end up with a lot more poverty, and to a large extent, people want to go overseas because they feel that every hour of their living life is worth earning in dollars or pounds. So you depreciate your own currency. And when you look at this currency depreciations over the years, if I remove the excessive ones, these are quite excessive. A country like Somalia, for example, maybe during the war, let's just remove those excessive ones. The excessive countries are in thousands. I'll just remove them. because they can give a better, they're most like outliers. And then the average rate for regions will then come to about 89% in Africa, 53 countries data. And on average, you will see that Central Africa seems to have the least, and I think it's because of mostly the French Francophone countries. They think their CFA seems to have been held on stronger than other African countries. But generally, you see the countries here in terms of North Africa and Southern Africa, their currencies have actually lost value more. And when you put that into context, then this other set of data would make sense, which is what we are looking at here, the next one. So we take the same countries again. I exclude these countries because I think they are unusual. Their data is very unusual because China seems to go overseas and they do go to work and maybe run businesses, not really as migrants per se. But generally, when I put the data in and I run it across by population, by country, I noticed that China, India particularly, has a similar demographics like Africa. That's about 1.3 billion population. Africa has about 1.3 billion. The average numbers in diaspora is about 17, it's about 1.something%. Africa has 140, which is about 10.7%. But the interesting part is when you look at the amount they remit, their national income, their remittances on average, they remit about 75. That's India. Remits about 77 billion. Africa remits about just 80. Similar also. In terms of income on average per capita, the general per capita in India, I'm trying to use India as a real proxy for Africa. India is about 1.9, I think it's about 1,900 per capita, and Africa is about 2,000. Funny enough, on average, Africa is about similar to India. But if you look at the Indian, in terms of their income capacity overseas, I use the average rate of 5%. I did different rates anyway. I tried 5% to say, okay, look, if somebody actually sends so much money back, so this kind of money is what they send back, and they actually are paying from the after-tax money, it means that they are earning about this much. If you use 5% as the typical tax rate and the social services rate, it's not realistic. But there you say 1.5 trillion, and Africa is about 1.6 trillion, which is not really less comparable. But if you change that to about, say, 25%, then obviously the income they're earning will be less, because what we're trying to use, we are using the remittances as a proxy. I mean, there's a lot of data done here, but it's a proxy I'm trying to work on. But what I'm trying to drive at really is this. To summarize is to come here and say, when you put the data into graphs, at 25% cost of living, or so-called social cost, what it comes down to on average is that you see that India seems to have this green line for India represents, so I'm just trying to pull it up. The green line would represent income from overseas for India. India has a marginally far higher income overseas than living locally. And that blue line, if they were living locally, that's what they would have been earning. And if you follow the same thing for Mexico, and obviously the remittances are a fraction of that income, that marginal difference. This is remittance. You go to Mexico, Mexico seems to be marginally less. But when you come to Africa, Africa seems to reflect almost exactly the same proportion of what they earn overseas and what they earn locally. So there's a marginal difference between what they earn overseas in dollars and what they earn locally. Now, one of the big problems with that is the exchange rate. Massive exchange rate differences. And when the exchange rates are bad, I don't have enough time to do all that here, but generally when I try to work on the exchange rate, if you look at the bad exchange rate, for example, use the best exchange rate, which is North Africa, which is here, Central Africa, for example, you will notice the graph that the marginal difference between the income earned overseas and the income earned while local is very little. But when you change it to a worse currency or a worse rate, let's say this percent, you will see that this graph is not marginally different, but you see a serious difference here, that the graph will come worse. What I'm trying to drive out really is when your currency is very weak. Unfortunately, sorry, I have too much data to do today, I don't have the time. Unfortunately, you end up with a disaster where your people would want to go overseas because they can do more in their lifetime per hour than staying local. So for me, coming to the question you asked about exodus is real. And the driving force is a lot more economic. While we have other social issues like dislocations, we have issues of displacement, we have issues of danger, security, we have issues of traveling for discovery, education, for example. We have desperation, we have disasters, we have disruptions, we've got displacement. All those Ds are pushing people overseas, and unfortunately, the first people to go are going to be the skilled force. So yes, the data suggests that Africans are moving overseas. Exodus is real. data validates that. Exodus for me is necessary because it leads to renewal. If it leads to renewal, at least you look at the story of Moses. At the end of Moses, went to Egypt, and the Israelites went to Egypt. They learned for so many years how to build the most successful economies. They built the economies, and they went back and built their own. The question is whether it's organized. When Exodus is not organized, then you have a crisis. Let me stop for now because
all right.